It is without question Donald Trump's single biggest vulnerability right now, and the greatest threat to his standing even among his own voters and supporters. Remember, many Americans signed up for a wholesale disruption of the status quo and are not yet startled by the dismantling of federal agencies. Many of them wanted to turn the tables on some of our most trusted alliances, and many approve of more aggressive policies on immigration and deportations. But what no one, not a single voter, signed up for was an economy that is right now flashing red in a state of mortal danger. Just look at how the Dow closed today, down around 700 points. Related or not, just this afternoon, Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, expressed some concern today, suggesting tariffs and the uncertainty surrounding their implementation could soon force the central bank to balance two somewhat conflicting goals: controlling inflation and supporting economic growth. The New York Times today adds a new layer to all this. Quote, economists and policymakers are still rubbing their eyes in wonder that an American president single-handedly threw the world into such economic turmoil and then celebrated. Consumer and business confidence has plunged. Uncertainty is paralyzing purchases, from a new home or car to a new factory. Investors have signaled their lack of faith in the U.S. economy by selling off Treasury bonds. That's the traditional haven when the outlook darkens. Again, these developments aren't just a threat to the people of this country and our nation's general sense of self and well-being. They also happen to represent what could be the gravest threat to Donald Trump's political standing ever since he came down the escalator. Recent polling suggests Trump is underwater on the economy. 56% of Americans disapprove of his handling of it. Just 44% approve. But that's the top line. Look deeper. Puck reports this, quote, even Trump's own voters are starting to express real concerns about his ability to bring down costs and manage the economy, an area that was once seen as a key strength of his, given his status as a quote-unquote businessman and candidate and president. Echelon found that while 74% of Trump 2024 voters strongly approve of his immigration policies, just 53% of his voters strongly approve of his handling of the economy. Indeed, there are red flags for Trump lurking in every corner and crosstab of the Echelon poll. Only 44% of voters approve of his handling of the economy, down 5 points since February. On tariffs, 55% of voters disapprove, up 6 points from February. A massive 70% of all voters now say they are concerned about tariffs. A measly 11% of voters say tariffs should be a top priority for the U.S. economy, a hilariously bad number for a key presidential priority. Today, those starved for signs of life from Trump's political opposition would be heartened to see what is actually happening, especially what California Governor Gavin Newsom announced, that he and his attorney general are suing the Trump administration in federal court over those sweeping tariffs. Watch.
We're asserting ourselves on behalf of 40 million Americans. And I imagine if you caucus those 40 million Americans, you'd find few, I don't care where they were in the last election, that are celebrating this uncertainty, that are celebrating the largest tax increase in modern U.S. history.
It's where we start today with some of our most favorite experts, reporters, and friends. CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Liesman is back. Also joining us, David Frum, staff writer for The Atlantic, host of the new video podcast, The David Frum Show. With me at the table, New York Times editorial board member, MSNBC political analyst Mara Gay's here. All right, Steve, I feel like everything, you're E.F. Hutton. I just dated myself forever, but what you say comes to pass, sometimes not in the next news cycle, but certainly by the next couple. And the economic underpinnings of what roiled the markets seem to have seeped into the minds of the voters and the people of this country, but perhaps more notably today, the Fed chair. Tell us what's on your radar.
So we got a 1-2 tariff punch to the market today. We began down sharply when NVIDIA, which you may know as one of the highest flyers of the 7 highest flying stocks we had, announced that it was going to take a very large charge because of a new a restriction being put on the export of chips that it had designed to meet prior export restrictions. Well, the market didn't like that, and it traded down. And that went across the day until about 1:30, when Fed Chair Jay Powell gave a speech, and where he said, you know what, these tariffs put us in a particular pickle. We cannot cut rates to save the economy if there's a downturn or a recession, because the tariffs threaten inflation. And only when we are sure that the inflation is temporary can we come in and cut interest rates. Now, of course, this is a particular situation because the Fed usually doesn't have a dilemma between these two situations. When unemployment falls, inflation. When unemployment rises, inflation falls. So it really doesn't have a dilemma. Tariffs do both. They cause the economy to decline and growth to contract, and they cause higher inflation. So the Fed is saying to the markets, we can't help you out here. And the markets took another leg down. It was a really tough day in the markets because the Fed chair said, we can't help.
And you're always so good at tying what the market is reacting to what people will sort of eventually have to contend with. And I've been reading both the Times as well as some regional papers from around the country. That used to be my job in the White House. And people are starting to apply local sort of needs and products to the global crisis that Trump has created. And people are starting to understand that things that are made here and things that are needed here to make things here are all in jeopardy.
I mean, that's right. And I mean, honestly, if the president had stopped for a second to think about any of this stuff, he almost certainly would have come up with a very different policy. But you can see, like when he first put tariffs on the auto companies, 3 days later, he came out and he got rid of them. And then he said, well, no, the auto companies need a little more time. Then he put them back on. Then he took them back off. It's really kind of very difficult for anybody to plan anything right now. But also, what we're learning is just how reliant we are on the imports that we get. If we could have been making it here, we would have been making it here. But there's something I looked at, Nicole, which I think is instructive. There's a thing called raw metals, the making of steel. And there's also fabricated metals. There are 4 times more employees that are working with the raw metals in fabricating it than there are the people who are making the raw steel. So we get these things in, we make profit from it, and we sell it, and we make money. And that's why, I'm sorry, but contrary to what the president says, we're one of the richest countries in the world. We are not poor. Those other countries are not taking advantage of us. That's not what's happening right now. Sure, there are places where we could possibly have a better relationship. But the idea of blowing everything up and then saying, OK, we're going to negotiate it. Well, you just get what you get. You know, you mess around and then you find out. And what we're finding out is that these trade relationships are very important to big companies. And I think what you just said, Nicole, is really significant, that individual Americans are finding out just how important these trade relationships are.
What is the posture of sort of the largest retailers in the country? I mean, my son plays travel baseball, so you go into lots of places, and Walmart is where if you forgot something you need, if you forgot a glove or a sock, they have that. If you need groceries, they have that. I mean, they can be sort of a beating heart of just about anywhere you go. These recognizable retailers that have everything on the shelves at affordable prices. What is the prospect for their ability to sustain prices and sustain supply?
Well, they're warning about all of that. They're warning that their profits may not be so high, or maybe lower than they had been. They're worried about the supply of things. It's interesting to use that word supply, Nicole, because what happened in the pandemic was what's called a supply shock. We couldn't get the stuff we needed. You stopped making cars because you couldn't make chips. And then the whole thing sort of cascades down, and then prices go up. This is going to be a supply shock. It's not like we can't live without these things and won't do okay, but what's going to happen is prices will go up or products won't be available. It's very indicative of what happened during the pandemic, and you have to brace for that. And it's quite remarkable. The pandemic was something that was created by nature and spread. This is something that is completely man-made. And I always say, don't mess around, because The world will come at you with things you haven't thought were coming your way, and you'll have to react. If we had a problem right now in which we needed Europe, Japan, or any of our allies right now, how eager would they be to come to our rescue in the event? You remember the great financial crisis? All the central banks got together and worked together to save the global financial system. Would that happen now? I think there's great risk that it wouldn't.
Danny, where did we begin? Last time we talked, a lot has happened since the last time we talked. And this judge right now is asking for everybody to provide more details, perhaps even sit for depositions. How's this going to pan out?
This road appears to be leading towards contempt. And in my opinion, I think contempt would have already been a stop on this road, except that I think judges, and I can't really hold this against them, but I think judges are going to be really reluctant to hold the Trump administration in contempt, because who are you going to hold in contempt? These lawyers are acting under orders. And we've already seen the one lawyer in the administration, the government lawyer, who admitted that the government mistakenly removed Abrego Garcia. He is on suspension. He's essentially administratively suspended. So the administration has sent a message: you toe the party line, or else you will not be handling this case. So the real thorny issue for any judge is, if you're going to hold someone in contempt, who's it going to be? Because everybody in the government has a boss, except for one person in the administration, and that's Donald Trump.
Right.
So who's in contempt here?
Yeah.
So, Danny, how long is it going to take for the Supreme Court, do you think, to clean up the language of their order?
They have to have something before them. And this, I knew this was going to happen, and I'm no fortune teller. I think anybody who read the Supreme Court's order knew it was problematic because it's not clear enough. It just sends the case back down to the district court, which is common, by the way. This happens all the time. Appellate courts will say, this isn't really for us to decide. We're going to send it back to the lower court, to the district court, who has a better command of the facts, and remand it with instructions, and they'll carry out the wishes of the Supreme Court or the appellate court that heard it. In this case, the Trump administration has just taken the tack of saying, well, the way we read the Supreme Court's order, we're perfectly within our power to say you cannot, court, infringe on the power of the executive branch. So if you ask the administration, I guarantee you they don't think they're defying any court orders. They think they are complying with the court order, and they believe the Supreme Court order from last week was a win for them, not a loss.
Right. So a couple of things going on here at the same time. First of all, Pablo, I have to just say this. Every time we cover this story, every hour we cover it, every time they call this one case a mistake, it is subliminally, or there is an underlying validation that all the others are completely okay. They are not. If you follow the law, they are not. None of these people received due process, and there's reporting now that a good number of them may not have even committed a crime. So we're following those parts of the story as well. At the same time, Pablo, this case puts a face to it, a family to it, a heart to it, a soul to it. And it seems to be breaking through. Chris Matthews on this show during this hour yesterday said people aren't going to like this. And I wasn't sure. I was a little worried. I was a little worried about the underlying subtext, subtone of racism in this country that might sort of just put these people in a different category that you don't think about, which is just unthinkable for me. But I was worried. I think I might have been wrong. I think there's a sense that people are seeing a difference between right and wrong here, and they don't like it.
I think they're seeing that this gentleman, this undocumented man, is the face not merely of a family, but...
Can I just say, undocumented man who came here to escape being tortured, to escape tyranny, for a better life.
Yes,
Continue.
this man, given that context, they repeatedly call a terrorist.
Yes.
Repeatedly, just in defiance of every bit of reporting that's available.
Many times.
The defamatory aspect of this, even leave that to the side.
Yeah.
What I am so encouraged by when it comes to these town hall meetings in Iowa across the country is that people are also seeing him as an avatar of due process, of the rule of law itself.
Even as an illegal immigrant.
Because, to your point, the Constitution does defend undocumented people in this regard. This is, I mean, again, to paraphrase Joe, I'm not even a country lawyer, but it's pretty clear if you read the 14th Amendment. If you see interviews with Antonin Scalia in the past, this is not a debate.
Right.
These people deserve due process, equal protection. The 5 freedoms, as they say. And, Mara, what I see happening is a very familiar song being played in autocratic regimes, which is that you are too endangered and we are too strapped for resources to care about the rule of law.
Right.
That is the argument that has been made in El Salvador by the self-appointed, self-described coolest dictator in the world. And that is the echo that we are getting from our president here, too.
You know, one of the things that you touched upon, the anger at the town halls from ordinary Americans suggests to me that they have a keen understanding that when you start violating due process for any human beings, even if they are not a citizen,
yes,
that threatens all of us. That threatens the entire system. And I'm encouraged by that as well. But Kilmar Garcia, I hope that Trump has miscalculated. And to your point, Mika, there's some evidence that maybe he has. But what concerns me even more, though, is if this is not a constitutional crisis, what does a constitutional crisis then look like? And is this a test case, a trial run for the Trump administration to try and do this with a U.S. citizen, to try and defy Supreme Court orders on Social Security, on DOJ, on any manner of other issues that are at the heart of our democracy for ordinary Americans? And so if the system cannot hold now for Kilmar Garcia, will it hold for the rest of us? And that is the question that we should be asking.
Michael Tomasky, let me ask you this. It seems that we're witnessing a confluence of events here with these situations. And we saw what happened in Iowa at Grassley's town hall meeting. And it seems at one level, there's a group of people called Americans, American citizens, who are witnessing what some of them, maybe more than we think, are witnessing a combination of incompetence and inequity coming from Washington, D.C. Incompetence in terms of the policy on tariffs, incompetence on who gets jailed and who gets scooped out of school and taken away to places that we don't know about, and inequity in terms of most Americans think, you know, I know the difference between fair and unfair, and this seems to be unfair to them. What's your view?
I agree 100%. I'll throw the word lawlessness in there as well, Mike. We could both probably throw in another half dozen adjectives, but I think it's important to add lawlessness, complete contempt for constitutional procedures and traditions and for the law. I agree with what Mika said and what apparently Matthew said yesterday, that I do think public opinion is turning around on this question as people watch this more and more, as people hear day after day different administration officials impugn this man, Mr. Abrego Garcia, without offering any evidence, without saying anything about, why they make these claims about his character and his past. You know, he was stopped in 2019 in Prince George's County. He was not charged with anything. He was turned over to ICE because he was an undocumented person, but he was released because there was no evidence that he was involved with anything. So, people are seeing this, and there's always going to be this core MAGA base, 30-something%, that's going to believe anything Trump and his people say and is going to say, he's undocumented, who cares? But that's a minority of this country. It really is. The majority cares about the idea that a man like this has due process rights under the United States Constitution.
I think everyone's kind of following this one so closely, Danny. So what's next? And also, what about the other cases that, again, are being kind of shoved to the side as like they're not a mistake when they are very clearly legal breaches?
Yeah, currently, I mean, there was an order by a district judge preventing these removals.
But they continue.
What, pardon?
They continue these flights, don't
Absolutely. Yes, they do. And the other thing, we've talked a lot about due process. And unfortunately, I can tell you as a criminal defense attorney, due process often only requires notice and an opportunity to be heard. The challenge with Kilmar Garcia and others in his position is that at most, maybe they're entitled to be returned and then put through the ordinary due process for removal. And if there are grounds for removal, and removal doesn't always require a criminal conviction. As a criminal defense attorney, that's the section of the statute I deal with all the time. But there are others. If you're on public assistance, for example, you are technically eligible to be removed. And if, for example, in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, if the Secretary of State determines that you pose a problem for foreign policy, whatever the heck that means, because no one appears to have ever used that subsection. I wasn't aware it was there, and it's right next to the section that every criminal defense attorney uses all the time. If that gives the Secretary of State that kind of power, then maybe they can remove that person. In a sense, that is not a constitutional crisis if it is legal, if it is lawful under federal law. Now, do we have a complaint that this law even exists to allow that? Yes, but there it is. Congress, for whatever reason, enacted that law. And what the Trump administration is unbelievably good at is finding these subsections in these arcane statutes, dusting them off, and using them with really incredible efficiency.
We have excellent lawyers, excellent. Have you noticed that lots of law firms have been signing up with Trump? $100 million, another $100 million for damages that they've done. What the hell? They give me a lot of money considering they've done nothing wrong. And we'll use some of those people, some of those great firms. They are great firms, too. They just had a bad moment. But we're going to use some of those firms to work with you on your leasing and your other things. And they'll do a great job. I think they're going to do a fantastic job.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. It is a classic children's story. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want some milk to go with it. And when it comes to Donald Trump and law firms, if you give him even just a little tiny inch of appeasement, he's never going to stop there, ever. That is the situation right now with several of the world's most prominent law firms who willingly walked into the Oval Office and made deals with Donald Trump in recent weeks. Each one of those firms proactively agreeing to fork over millions of dollars in pro bono work in order to evade punishment in the form of an executive order against their firms. There is brand new reporting in the New York Times today that finds this, quote, Trump, it turns out, has a far more expansive view of what those firms can be called on to do. Over the last week, Trump has suggested that the firms will be drafted into helping him negotiate trade deals. He has mused about having them help with his goal of reviving the coal industry. And he has hinted that he sees the promises of nearly $1 billion in pro bono legal services that he has extracted from the elite law firms, including Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, Skadden, Arps, Slate, Nigger, and Flom, and Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher as a legal war chest to be used as he, Donald Trump, wishes, end quote. So predictable, you're tempted to laugh, right? These firms thought they were avoiding future conflict through appeasement. When in the history of humans has that ever been the case? They thought that by making Trump happy on the front end, they could go about their business on the back end forever. But as the Times reports out today, quote, the emerging gap between what the firms initially thought they agreed to and what Trump says they can be used for shows how the deals did little to insulate them from his whims. Further demands on the firms from Trump could raise the potential for conflicts with paying clients and could further fuel internal dissension, end quote. Meanwhile, there are firms that did not take this route, that chose not to cave to Trump's demands. Wilmer Hale, Jenner & Block, and Perkins Coie, when they fought against the Trump administration's revenge orders. Judges have all ruled in their favor, temporarily pausing the executive orders the administration placed on those firms. And yesterday, there was another judge ruled in favor of the firms standing up to Trump and fighting the executive orders. Separate reporting in the Times finds this, quote, a federal judge on Tuesday blocked President Trump from punishing the law firm Sussman Godfrey, calling the retribution campaign he has waged from the White House against the nation's top firms, quote, a shocking abuse of power. Donald Trump's escalating war on law firms is where we begin the hour with New York Times investigative reporter, MSNBC national security contributor Mike Schmidt, whose byline is on that first piece of Times reporting we read from. Also joining us is voting rights attorney, founder of Democracy Docket, our friend Mark Elias, and former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice, now an MSNBC legal analyst. Mary McCord is here. Mike, take us through what you and your colleagues are reporting.
So if you're following the law firm story like we are, at the beginning of last week, it looked like it might be sort of petering out. There were more deals that were happening. They were happening with firms that... Petering
out on which end?
Well,
more EOs or more deals?
It just seemed like the momentum of the story was sort of slowing down. There were more deals that were happening. They were happening with firms, some firms that I had never heard about. We weren't, it looked like it was going to continue, but sort of any jarring developments in the story didn't seem like they were afoot. But what happens by the middle of last week is that comment after comment Trump is making, and then that Peter Navarro made, shows that the White House's understanding of the deals is far more expansive than what the firms thought they were getting themselves into. Because if you go back and you look at how the firms got themselves into this situation, how does someone like Brad Karp, the head of Paul Weiss, get himself to make this deal? They believe that they're just committing to doing pro bono legal work on issues that they're already working on. It's not a big deal. They're not capitulating to Trump because what they're doing in their own minds is just, we already do stuff for Veterans Affairs. We already do stuff to fight anti-Semitism. So committing this money to Trump to do this pro bono legal work, we're not really giving anything up. This is actually a good deal for us. But what you start to see in Trump's comments last week, and then which backed up by our reporting about what's going on inside the White House, is that they think that this pro bono legal work can be used in a lot of different ways. And in ways to potentially help Trump himself, in ways to go out and do tariff negotiations. And what happens is that this is what could really happen, is that, Boris Epstein or someone in the White House or Trump himself could go to the firms and say, hey, guys, we want you to do this work. And that would put the firms in an even more difficult position. They thought that they got themselves out of Dodge by making these deals, by going ahead and committing this amount of money and having Trump put out these Truth Social posts and not having to be hit with these executive orders. But they could now find themselves in a position of having to say no to Trump. And obviously, if they say no to Trump, they could be hit with another executive order again and find themselves back at square one.
Mark Elias, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really put my finger on what would make a good or bad lawyer. But I would think that central to a good lawyer would be a student of history. And what lawyer looks at what case history in the area of appeasement and thinks that this is going to be good lawyering?
I mean, if the version of what the law firms are telling the New York Times is correct, then every client should fire them. I mean, they are literally the most incompetent lawyers in America, because it isn't possible that all of these high-priced millionaire lawyers in Washington, D.C. thought that if they made a deal with Donald Trump, that Donald Trump was effectively getting nothing. They were getting everything. And none of this would come back to bite them. I mean, that's honestly what they're trying to sell people. It's what they tried to sell their associates. It's what they tried to sell their partners. And honestly, it was a bunch of nonsense. And I have to think, for their own self-worth and for their own dignity, that they didn't actually believe that. I mean, I have to believe that they were actually smarter than that, and that what they were doing is like in the scene in The Godfather, where the Godfather says, someday, and that day will never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. And they were just hoping the day would never come. But they knew that if the day came that the Godfather said, I need a service for you, they're going to do the service. So let's just start with this. The law firms are never standing up to Donald Trump. The law firms that ceded the last shred of their dignity, had their backbones extracted from them and handed them over to Boris Epstein, like those law firms are fully, wholly owned by Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump says, go represent the coal industry, they'll say yes. If they say, go represent us in these trade deals, they'll hem and they'll haw, but they'll say yes. They've got no leverage at this point. They have sold their last piece of their soul to Donald Trump in the hope that he never comes and asks them for anything. But when he does, as he always does, because Donald Trump won't ask for something just because he needs a favor. He asks for it because it humiliates the person he demands it from. And he's going to humiliate each and every one of these law firms by demanding they do something that is odious to them. And they will say, yes, sir, with tears in their eyes.
U.S. District Judge Paula Zenas, who's overseeing Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, is now weighing contempt proceedings against the Trump administration for failing to act in returning Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. During a hearing yesterday, Zenas scolded Justice Department officials for doing nothing to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from El Salvador's notorious prison, telling them to cancel vacations and other appointments in order to comply with a 2-week inquiry into the matter. She added there will be no tolerance for gamesmanship or grandstanding. In an 8-page written order, Zenas said 4 senior officials from Homeland Security and the State Department must sit for depositions by next Wednesday to produce details under oath about their attempts to bring him back. Zenas also called out the Trump administration for its semantics over the word facilitate in its read of both her order and the Supreme Court's order. In a status report ahead of yesterday's hearing, a Trump administration attorney wrote that even if Abrego Garcia does make it back to the U.S., the administration will only deport him again. For his part, President Trump continues to argue he won the decision 9-0, and that the matter is entirely in the hands of El Salvador. Let's bring in NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney. And Ken, what do you make of the order here? And what it appears this judge, I'm assuming that even the press conference that the president had with the president of El Salvador, where the entire cabinet chimed in, probably not helpful.
Good morning, Mika. Good morning, Joe. No, in fact, the judge said that she disregarded that news conference. She didn't believe that that was evidence of really anything. But I think one of the real takeaways from this whole saga so far is that there's no evidence that anyone from the Trump administration, the president or anyone else, has even asked El Salvador to return this man. So when you talk about the definition of the word facilitate, the lawyer for the Trump administration in that hearing yesterday said that they believe that facilitate is if he presents himself at a port of entry, they will facilitate his admission back to the United States, where they will, of course, try to deport him again, as you mentioned. But the judge was not having this. She was very frustrated, obviously. It's been very clear to her and other observers and the lawyers for Mr. Abrego Garcia that the Trump administration has been resisting. They have not done a single thing to try to get this guy back from El Salvador. And you're right, Joe, the Supreme Court ruling does give them a little wiggle room here because they apparently don't feel like they can bind the executive branch in any way in terms of their relations with another country. But it's clear that the courts have said this man was wrongly deported. And yet again, the administration has not asked for him back. They've not made that simple request. And so you're right, Mika, what this judge appears to be doing here with this inquiry and putting people under oath is setting the stage for a potential contempt order. Now, we've seen those in the past. Executive branch officials have been held in contempt. The Interior Secretary was at one point over handling of some Native American trusts. And generally, that's a symbolic act because to the extent that the judge issues fines, the federal government can pay endless amounts of fines. But in this case, you really wonder how far this judge will be willing to go to enforce her order in the face of resistance and recalcitrance from these executive branch officials. Would she order someone placed in jail? And then the next question is, who enforces that order? Is it the U.S. Marshals? Well, they work for the Attorney General. So would the Attorney General tell them not to carry out that order, even though it's a lawful order from a court? And then if that happens, could the court appoint someone else with a badge and a gun to enforce that kind of court order? It really raises some uncomfortable questions, but that's what happens when an administration appears to defy the courts, guys.
Well, it raises uncomfortable questions. Again, the Supreme Court also. It's not just this federal judge, this district judge that's looking at what the Trump administration is doing and what they did inside the White House and what they did with the president of El Salvador yesterday. You've got 9 justices on the Supreme Court who are looking to, and as the Wall Street Journal editorial board writes about the case, they're not pleased. Mr. Abreu Garcia is being held under an agreement in which the administration is paying El Salvador $6 million to house migrants this year. Since the Supreme Court has ordered efforts to facilitate the return, continuing to pay El Salvador for his detention would violate that order, writes the Wall Street Journal editorial page. The larger problem is that Mr. Abreu Garcia was deported without due process, writes Murdoch's Wall Street Journal editorial page. Mr. Trump would be wise to settle all of this by quietly asking Mr. Bukele to return Mr. Garcia, who has a family in the U.S., but the president may be bloody-minded enough that he wants to show the judiciary who's boss. If this case does become a judicial showdown, Mr. Trump may assert his Article 2 powers not to return Mr. Abreu Garcia, and the Supreme Court would be reluctant to disagree. But Mr. Trump would be smarter to play the long game. He has many much bigger issues than the fate of one man that will come before the Supreme Court. By taunting the judiciary in this manner, he is inviting a rebuke on cases that carry far greater stakes. And again, this is, going back to Signalgate, it could be an example of the administration fighting to win a battle and ending up losing a political war. Ken Dilanian, I'm reminded back in 2017 when Donald Trump started attacking federal judges on Twitter at the time, talking to a relative of a federal judge who was in the Federalist Society, very conservative, saying, not a smart move. An attack on one federal judge is an attack on all federal judges. And you saw it time and time again over the next 3.5 years that even the most conservative justices had no patience for the White House thumbing their nose at any federal judges.
Yeah, Joe, that's right. It's one thing for the Trump administration to lose the Wall Street Journal editorial board on tariffs. That's to be expected. But they've lost them now on these rule of law questions. This isn't the first time they've editorialized against them on the rule of law. And they've also lost regular folks in Iowa. I hadn't heard that recording of the Grassley town hall. That was remarkable. So across the board, look, you can't talk to any legal expert, anyone in the legal community who doesn't work for Donald Trump, who thinks this is a good idea, who thinks that the way they've handled this is appropriate. People get really concerned and rattled when a president appears to be defying court orders and an order of the Supreme Court. It's a constitutional crisis, essentially. Now, there's some, as you said, there's wiggle room here. And if this goes back up to the Supreme Court, we can all only hope that they clarify what they mean for the Trump administration to do and spell it out and make it happen, guys.
All right, NBC's Ken Dilanian, thank you so much. And we're going to play the comments that Abreu Garcia's wife made yesterday as well in just a moment. But professor at Georgetown University Law Center, Stephen Vladeck, had a piece for The Atlantic entitled, "What the Courts Can Still Do to Constrain Trump." And he writes in part this: "What's important to recognize is that federal courts have not reached the end of the road in this case. There is a wide swath of daylight and of judicially available relief between invading El Salvador and just taking the government at its fashionably preposterous claim that it's totally powerless. Federal courts can't tell the executive branch what to do, but they can tell it what it can't do. And they can provide powerful incentives for the executive branch to choose to take specific steps on its own. A world in which the federal courts become reflexively skeptical of any effort to remove anyone from the United States is one in which the Trump administration's conduct in this one case will prevent it from accomplishing many of its broader immigration policy goals. Of course, Trump and his advisors might think that is a price worth paying. But like so much of their behavior in this case, that too would be revealing, Joe. There's a long way to go here.
Well, I mean, a long way to go. Also, a lot of options for the courts. They can actually cut at the very heart of this Alien Enemies Act that the Trump administration is using and say that it's unconstitutional. It can no longer do that. That's what the professor said later in that Atlantic article. But David French, love to get your input on this. I'm reminded of, I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who said, hard cases make bad law. This is a hard case, and it's a hard case because actually, if Mr. Garcia were from, say, Honduras, that would be much cleaner. Return him to the United States. We will send him back. We will deport him back to Honduras. Here, he's from El Salvador. He's in El Salvador. And yet in 2019, there was a federal judge that said you can't return him back to El Salvador because his life will be endangered. So sort through everything that you've seen and very interested in your take on what the next move is, because we already know this federal district court judge is moving aggressively to make sure the White House doesn't defy court orders. Then it goes to the Supreme Court. What should we expect?
Well, yeah, part of this is complicated and part of this is simple. The complicated element is it is true that the Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction over the government of El Salvador. There are limits to what the Supreme Court can order the federal government to do in this instance. But what is simple is that the federal government and the Trump administration is obviously not powerless here. And it's very simple and very clear that they're doing nothing at all to effectuate the court's order to facilitate Garcia's return. So an administration acting in good faith here would immediately request his return as a diplomatic matter, immediately seek the return very firmly and clearly. It's obvious the administration is not acting in good faith in response to the Supreme Court or the district court. And Joe, you're right. There is a little bit of wiggle room from saying there is direct defiance of the Supreme Court in this moment. But it is absolutely obvious that right now the administration is demonstrating no intention to do anything.
And David, let's underline that right now, because for people that haven't read the decision, for people that haven't looked at the language, for people that didn't see the news stories written in the New York Times, Washington Post, before the White House appeared to defy the order, there were already warnings that the Supreme Court had written such a sort of a general instruction to the Trump administration on one hand to facilitate, and then on the other side of it said, and by the way, court, you can't do anything to get in the way of the executive's power to run foreign policy. I mean, that gave two loopholes to the Trump administration that you knew they were going to drive a truck through, and they have.